Laura Kuenssberg stepped down as the BBC's political editor earlier this year after 8 years in the job. But don't worry, she's not disappearing from our TV screens just yet, because from September, she'll be hosting the BBC's new flagship Sunday politics show, Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg. Very imaginative. Here's a teaser.
Morning. Come and have a seat. Now, of course, I'm not going to go easy on you. There are some really big questions we've got to try and get answers to this morning. But I'll be fair, and we just want to hear what you've got to say. So, shall we get on with it?
We're rolling.
Here we go. Join me to hear from the biggest names inside and outside politics.
Accompanying that announcement, Kuenssberg also did a rare interview with the Sunday Times. And a few quotes from it certainly got me thinking. This one is about the fact that Kuenssberg doesn't like to talk about her private life and why. Her friends attribute her reticence to a combination of Reithian values, Kuenssberg embodying the BBC principle of impartiality, and a fear of trending on Twitter for something she didn't quite say. I think we've missed the boat on that one. She's very wary of the circus around her, says one. Laura takes the rule that the journalist should never become the story incredibly seriously. And then there's her total commitment to BBC impartiality. I have no clue how she votes. The claims of Kuenssberg's impartiality will come as rather surprising news to some. After all, this is someone who was labelled as the most divisive woman on TV by The Telegraph in 2017. Now, you can think that's unfair, sexist, and should be ignored because you don't like the newspaper which published it. But the point is that many, many people don't view Laura Kuenssberg as especially impartial. That's not just an opinion. Because in January 2017, the BBC Trust ruled that a report in November 2015 by Kuenssberg broke the broadcast impartiality and accuracy guidelines. The item in question featured an interview with Jeremy Corbyn on the BBC News at 6. It gave the incorrect impression that the Labour leader disagreed with police use of firearms in incidents such as that month's terrorist attacks in Paris. The report featured Corbyn's answer to a more general question, which was not broadcast. Basically, they cut and pasted an answer to a different question. Really unforgivable stuff. The BBC Trust said this misrepresentation was, quote, compounded when Kuenssberg went on to state that Corbyn's message, quote, couldn't be more different from that of May, who was about to publish anti-terrorism proposals. How convenient. Nevertheless, the BBC Trust found no evidence that there had been any intention to mislead, and their ruling was that the footage, quote, had been compiled in good faith. Another memorable moment came during the 2019 election. Then Kuenssberg, alongside Robert Peston and other senior journalists, tweeted this. So Matt Hancock was dispatched to Leeds General, sorry, not just Leeds Hospital, to try and sort out mess, hearing Labour activists scrambled to go and protest, and it turned nasty when they arrived, and one of them punched Hancock's advisor. No alleged there. Yes, a Labour activist had punched a Conservative Party advisor outside a hospital in Leeds, according to Kuenssberg, except there was not a grain of evidence for this. It turns out the incident never happened. Almost immediately, footage was released showing this was untrue. Kuenssberg later apologised, kind of, and retracted her tweet. Happy to apologise for earlier confusion about the punch. That wasn't a punch outside Leeds General. 2 sources suggest it had happened, but clear from video, that was wrong. You might not be surprised to hear that the following year, the BBC's Executive Complaints Unit stated it found no evidence of political bias, nor that Laura Kuenssberg had failed to check the story before publication. In her apology, Kuenssberg noted that 2 sources had told her the story was true, and she hence decided to publish it. 2 sources, probably from the same side with the same motivations. What a joke. Now, these are just some of the worst examples of perceived bias. There are numerous others. We don't have all the time to cover them. We would have to do a whole Tysky Sour series. But as much as Kuenssberg's style of political journalism can be grating, it seems to be something lost on herself, as she told The Times. The Dallas and Dynasty level drama in the last few years has meant that we've all spent a lot of time listening to what seemed like screaming and shouting in Westminster. Just by virtue of bandwidth, that's crowded out some issues that are actually more relevant in everybody's daily lives. Now, maybe you disagree, but I think that's the precise genre of journalism that Kuenssberg personifies for years. With the BBC political editor seemingly more interested in Westminster gossip and triviality than the debates, grievances, and challenges which actually matter to people in this country. Ash, will you be eagerly watching Laura Kuenssberg's new Sunday show?
I prefer not to speak. If I speak, I am in very big trouble. I mean, genuinely, right? When Laura Kuenssberg is criticized by people who are on the left, it is framed almost inevitably as abuse, harassment, and threat. Now, I, of course, totally condemn anyone hurling abuse, threats, or harassing journalists. I think that's totally wrong. But there's a way in which valid criticism has been bundled up with all of those things, I think, in a very cynical way, in order to delegitimize the people who are making the critiques and also to delegitimize the critiques themselves. Something that you will always hear is, this person's a great journalist. They're totally impartial. I've got no idea how they vote. You hear that about Laura Kuenssberg. You hear that about Andrew Neil. You hear that about Robert Peston. Now, of course, I don't have a 100% clear idea of how they vote or if they vote. It's a secret ballot. That is the nature of a democracy. But the idea that you cannot detect political and social sympathies from a journalist's output is so insulting that it doesn't deserve to be printed uncritically in any newspaper of note. So, as you've shown, Aaron, there is a clear difference in Laura Kuenssberg's coverage in terms of how she was presenting Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour left, and the sympathetic ear that she was giving to the Tory party during that time. Now, it doesn't mean she was never critical of Tory party politicians, but the threshold for being critical was so much higher. Another massive difference in how the practice of journalism was different according to the political affiliation of what was being covered is which sources are considered to be unimpeachable, and therefore you're able to repeat what they tell you verbatim, and which sources aren't. If something was coming from the Jeremy Corbyn Labour team, it was very often something which was editorialized in a way to say, hey, you can't really trust this source. Indeed, if there was something coming out which was detrimental to the Conservative Party, it would be very often editorialized by Laura Kuenssberg in a way which was minimizing. And I'll give you an example. When there were stories coming out about Tory party Islamophobia, this was happening simultaneously to a period in time when Labour anti-Semitism stories were almost on a daily basis leading the Today programme. Laura Kuenssberg editorialised in a tweet saying this is on a different political scale. Now, why is it on a different political scale? Because in terms of the numbers of complaints, it's clearly not. If you're talking about the proportion of members who self-identify as having Islamophobic views, it's way higher amongst the Tory party. So what's different here on the political scale other than you, for some reason, have a bias, you are partial in favor of either one political party or against a particular religious minority group? I mean, pick one. So I think that there are all sorts of ways in which her journalistic practice is shot through by partiality and bias. And it's insulting to all of us for the lobby to maintain this, I think, absurd charade of, oh, well, no one can actually tell what she really thinks. No, you can really tell what she thinks. You can tell who she thinks of as being a legitimate political player and who she thinks shouldn't be in politics at all. It is obvious.
Well said. More of that in a second. I want to return on this issue of impartiality and whether BBC journalists can cover the news as they see fit. And more of that Sunday Times piece here. Many journalists consider the BBC's impartiality limiting, with Marr saying he was getting his voice back by leaving. Andrew Marr, Laura Kuenssberg's predecessor on the Sunday show. But Kuenssberg sees it differently. People say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that, you're terribly restricted, she says. For me, that's totally upside down because the whole point at the BBC is that you're not following the line, all you're doing is trying to find the truth. I've never been told what to say or what not to say, maybe more importantly. I've never been told what to say or what not to say. Now, I believe her for what it's worth. I believe that nobody has told Laura Kuenssberg explicitly what to say or not say as BBC political editor. There's no massive conspiracy orchestrated from on high. But here's the thing. There doesn't need to be, and that doesn't need to happen for journalists to fail in doing their job. Here's Noam Chomsky explaining precisely that point to Andrew Marr.
I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads, that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists are self-censoring?
I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Noam Chomsky, that's such a great quote. Ash, do you think figures like Kuenssberg, or just elite journalists in general, even engage with that question of self-censorship?
No, they absolutely don't. I mean, I can give you an example from fairly recently. I was in Edinburgh and I was on Ian Dale's All Talk show kind of thing. And I was asking him, look, did you cover the Ford report when it came out? And the findings of this report were pretty damning in terms of saying that, yes, Labour does have a problem with a hierarchy of racism. And he said, no, I didn't. And first he said that he didn't because it was the Tory party mega meltdown of Boris's resignation. It wasn't. It was actually after that. And they said, oh, no, it wasn't because it was the heat wave. Now, that would never have been an excuse to not cover, say, the Labour Party EHRC report. In fact, many much more minor events of the Labour Party were religiously and ferociously covered by the likes of Ian Dale or indeed many other lobby journalists as well, except the Ford report wasn't. And so rather than thinking about why that is, of how the story of the day, the dominant political narrative, is shaped by the collective behavior of an incredibly restricted and homogenous group of journalists, they fall back on this old canard of, well, no one tells us what to write. Of course, they wouldn't have to. I think I saw someone on Twitter say nobody buys a dog only to bark themselves.
I mean, look, we started Novara Media precisely because the arguments that we make, the points we discuss, the stories we try and cover weren't being reflected in legacy media. That's what we did. And that gap is there for a reason. It's because media reflects and represents the interests of wealthy people. And like I say, Ash, if you're an ambitious young person and you're one of these political anorex, political geeks, which all these journalists claim to be in Westminster, I find that a very strange thing. You know, being interested in voting systems, but not actually helping people and ending food poverty. But maybe I'm just eccentric. If you're that kind of person and you're interested in these things, and you're ambitious and you want to get a job, you need to get a job, you need to feed yourself, and then you like the status and the money and the profile, you have to have identikit neoliberal views. It's not a $64 million question. You are not going to have a great, well-paying job, high status, knowing the right people, well-connected, if you start saying, yeah, you know what, I think we should have universal basic services. Let's have free electric buses. You know, let's end the housing crisis. Why don't we just have stagnant house prices for 25 years like in Japan? That sort of things out. Let's have a pay ratio in this country of 10-1. Works for the British Army. Why can't it work for the private sector? If you have those opinions, you're not going to get anywhere in the media. You're not going to get anywhere in politics.
Now, as you may recall, Jess Brammer left her job at Huffington Post and she started a role at BBC News. And Guido Fawkes, the Daily Mail, right-wing newspapers had an absolute big fit about it because Huffington Post, while she was editor, had published critical material of Boris Johnson. People went nuts for it. They said this totally impugns the BBC's impartiality. No one ever said that about Nick Robinson, who was, of course, the president of his university Conservative Association. No one ever said that when Robbie Gibb joined the BBC after having worked under Theresa May. Nobody said that about Tim Davie, who I believe stood as a Conservative candidate. So if you want to look at much more explicit examples of political partiality in the BBC, they're there. They're obvious. And yet the story that you get in right-wing newspapers is trying to drum out anyone who could be described as, you know, to the left of George Osborne, because that's how they entrench their political project. And that's why the BBC is so fiercely contested. So anybody who hides behind impartiality is either a total idiot and has a level of critique that you would find embarrassing for a 5-year-old, or they're cynically weaponizing impartiality to be able to build right-wing power within the institution.